Hello friends, welcome to this session where we are going to discuss in philosophy on one of the most important topics. In our previous two sessions also we discussed on problems of personal identity. We have conducted two sessions on the same topic, and now this is the third session where we are going to talk on problems of personal identity. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center of Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Ajay Verma is a prolific professor who believes in giving his knowledge to the students, and he is making continuous and persistent efforts to make the subject philosophy easier for the students. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Ajay Verma on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Ajay Verma once again and request him to continue the series on problems of personal identity further. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika. Hello viewers, as you're already aware, we have been talking about the problem of personal identity, which is which of late has gained a lot of importance in especially in analytic philosophy. But as we talked about it earlier, it has a long history. And though in its most sort of well-developed form, its most structured form, it's first put forth by Locke. In some of our previous lectures, we have tried to look at how Locke tries to formulate this problem, and what are the problems regarding personal identity that he points out, what is the solution that he seems to suggest, and what later on another thinker, Thomas Reid, so what are the different objections that Thomas Reid has to Locke's take on this particular issue. So today, since we are talking about this problem after a long time, we are sort of continuing with this problem after a long time. So it'll be desirable for us to have a quick recap of what we have discussed in our previous two lectures, and then we could go on to discuss Hume's view of personal identity, and we'll try to look at how Hume tries to sort of advance over the views that were earlier expressed by Locke, the kind of skepticism that Locke initially expresses, but at the same time he tries to give us certain clues. He tries to sort of give us some suggestions in a positive direction towards what could be the basis on which a notion like personal identity could be formulated, what could be the exact foundation on which we could come up with some kind of a notion of personal identity. So now this is the agenda we would follow for today's lecture. So now let's have a quick recap about what exactly do we understand when we talk about problem of personal identity. What exactly is the problem that we are discussing? So, first of all, even before we begin talking about personal identity, it'll be desirable for us to talk about what exactly do we mean when we talk about identity of something. And once we have some kind of a notion regarding what do we mean by identity of something, then it'll become much easier for us to understand what are the different problems associated with the problem of personal identity. Because when we talk about personal identity, the same problems probably which are associated with anything whatsoever are taken over to the problem of somebody being a person. So first of all, let's try and understand what is the problem of identity as such, because Hume has a lot to say on this, and Hume is the main philosopher today we'll be discussing. So when it comes to the problem of identity, the basic idea is, when we are talking about identity of an object, the main idea is that we think of an object as sort of continuing in time. First of all, in philosophy, our main problem is that of intelligibility of things. We somehow cannot live, believing that things do not have any meaning for us. I mean, things could be without any meaning. Things could be without structure. This world could be entirely unstructured, and it could be completely chaotic. This idea doesn't fit well with us for some reason. If the world is like this, then probably it'll cause a lot of anxiety to us. So we are happier believing that world must have some kind of structure to it, where we could think of things as having some kind of a nature of their own, where we could have some basis of believing that things are of a certain kind, of a certain type. There are certain essences that things have, because of which we assign some kind of a meaning to them. They are what they are in virtue of some basic factors that most of the time we want to believe are inherent in them. Most of the time we want to believe that there is something intrinsic to an object which makes that particular object or thing what it actually is. And on that basis, we generally tend to assign an identity to an object, and start believing that a particular object is such and such. So here it may be clear that here we're talking about two issues, because the problem of essences is not exactly the same as problem of identity, but the two are related for several reasons. So when we talk about essences of object, then probably what we are talking about is that there has to be some kind of metaphysical reason for us to believe that an object is what it is. So we generally want to believe that chairs are chairs and tables are tables, mountains are mountains, and things are what things are, how they make appearance before us. So things are fundamentally what they are, and this is also, we could extend the same argument over language also, and we could say that unless things are what they are, unless they have something persisting in them, something that is there in them by the way of their nature, we wouldn't really have a good metaphysical basis with us to assign certain designations to them, unless, of course, we are nominalists. Nominalism is basically an idea, where we say that naming is not really concerned with the actual nature of the object. Naming is something entirely different. So that we want to give up that kind of a metaphysical commitment which otherwise we have when we talk about essences, and if we believe in essentialism, which naturally follows from essences, if we have robust idea of essences of things, then it naturally leads to the idea of essentialism, that every object in the world has some kind of an essence in itself, because of which we know it to be so and so. It appears before us to be so and so, and it all the time has some essence inherent in it, which persists and continues in time, and because of which it has a particular place in the world. And what makes it also distinct, it is also principle of differentia. So if everything has the same essence, then the principle of differentiation between different objects would also be lost to us. So different things have different essences. to them. And on the basis of that, most of the time we may want to ascribe different identities to them. And identities, could be formulated on the basis of maybe set of qualities. So at times we may want to group together certain objects, or we may want to believe that certain objects belong to the same class, same group, because of something that is common to all of them. So identity could be based. Our ascription of identity to things could be based on several factors. One basis is qualitative, where we believe that since several objects are qualitatively the same, qualitatively all of them have the same set of qualities, so we could believe that some kind of a same identity could be ascribed to all of them. But if we talk about numerical identity, that's a different question altogether. So when we talk about numerical identity, then we are also referring to the ideas like space and time. So what we here believe is that is the same object, numerically also the same, which continues, which persists through a particular passage of time. So these two questions are different in nature. Qualitative, identity as qualitative basis of formulating an identity, solves a different kind of a purpose for us, for the purpose of metaphysics. And as far as the metaphysics is concerned, when we are talking about numerical identity, numeric identity, then we are addressing to a different set of question, and we'll see how in Hume this distinction becomes important. But even before that, let's talk about, let's try to have a look at what could be the different bases of formulating identity of something. So one crucial basis, as we just pointed out, could be a numerical identity. Everything is what it is in virtue of occupying a particular space and time reference, and so far as that object is there, in whatever with whatever intrinsic nature that it has, so far as it's occupying the same time space reference, it cannot be identified completely with any other object in the world. As a matter of fact, this idea of numerical identity is most robustly formulated by Leibniz in his principle of identity of the indiscernibles. So there the basic idea is, if two objects x and y are identical, strictly identical in every respect, then as a matter of fact they are not two but one. So if the objects are indiscernible, there is no principle of differentia. Then there are no basis on the basis, no principle on the basis of which we could differentiate the two. Then it naturally logically follows from it that without any principle of differentia, we cannot think of two different objects. That means then these apparently two different things are not two but one. So if the things are two, then there has to be at least some minimal basis, whatever, some basis on some basis of differentia, some basis on the on which we could differentiate the two objects. So there has to be at least one property which is there in one and not there in the other. So that way, numeric identity refers to a very minimal thing, a very minimal kind of a logical mathematical requirement, something very very basic. that if there have to be two things instead of one, then there has to be some basis of differentiating between the two. There has to be some point of differentia between the two objects, and if none exists, then there is no basis for us to come up with any kind of pluralistic idea of the world. Then we'll have no way but to look at the world from a non-dualistic or monistic point of view. So that's basically the idea, among others. That's the main thrust of the point of numeric identity. But if you look at it closely, for different purposes, I mean, it's a bare minimum notion. It's a kind of, it only seems to be fulfilling some kind of mathematical requirement for identity, some kind of logical concern for identity. But as we are already aware, in case of most the logical rules, most the logical axioms, in symbolic logic, what we are concerned about is the form, especially in formal logic, as we call it. We are concerned with the form of the argument, not with the content of the argument. Similarly here, if we restrict the notion of identity strictly to the notion of numeric identity, then there is a lot that goes out the window, so to speak. Then we are working with a very, very thin notion of identity, and many of the other philosophical issues that are concerned with the notion of identity, are given away, and also very importantly, since the notion of numerical identity, if we restrict the notion of identity to strictly numerical identity, then whatness of the thing also becomes contingent. We wouldn't really be concerned about the whatness of thing, what a thing is, which is very important also from the point of view of essences of thing. So when we are talking about numerical identity of thing, then it could be anything, anything in the world, smallest to the largest, has a numerical identity. So even the differences, like whether we are talking about life forms or whether we are talking about unlively or non-living objects, even that distinction goes away. When we're talking strictly about the numerical identity of something, then we are not so much concerned, as I just said, about the whatness of thing. What is the thing that we are talking about? But as we just saw, that the question of essence and the question of identity are also related in a certain way. Therefore, the question of whatness of things and giving it up when we restrict the notion of identity to purely mathematical identity or purely numerical identity, then the question of whatness is given up, and that seems to be giving away too much. Because the question of whatness of thing is also important. What makes a thing, what it actually is. What makes, because, this is how we ascribe meaning to it. We cannot, give certain questions regarding language away, certain epistemological questions for that matter away. Because when we talk purely about numerical identity, then, the epistemological questions regarding like how we know an object, what kind of on what basis we know an object to be so and so, they become secondary. They don't come to the picture in a robust way when we talk about identities purely in terms of numbers, purely in terms of space and time references. So the question regarding what makes an object what it is, like what makes a chair, has been an important question for a long time, starting with Plato probably. It's an important question. The question of meaning is an important question. Plato sort of extensively deals with it, and he points out that there is some kind of world of ideas which is beyond the space and time references, and is beyond such empirical contingencies that our ordinary world is subject to. And therefore, this ordinary world of ours, this empirical world of ours, and the things that exist therein, come to have meaning at all in virtue of the fact that these things are imperfect copies of the forms that exist, the perfect forms that exist in in a different world altogether, which is beyond space and time, in some kind of a transcendental world which transcends our sensory world of experience. So this problem of how do things appear to have a meaning for us, that question becomes completely secondary, non-important to us when we talk about identity strictly in terms of numerical identity. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that numerical identity is one way of talking about identity, but it is too thin to form, to result in some kind of robust notions of identity. And the idea of personal identity is included in it. Now, what could be the next good candidate, next good basis for us to have some kind of a good robust idea of identity as such? Probably it could be something something that has to do with the material basis of an object as such. So we know that all things are in a certain way material. Most of the things that we talk about, they have some kind of material presentation. So in that sense, since things things are substantial in a certain way, we want to believe that though the qualities are the qualitative aspect only of the object becomes available to us, but at the same time we want to believe that things have some kind of a substance to themselves, where which acts as a kind of a location for all these different qualities to exist in. So we want to work with that notion, and most of the time we want to believe that things the substance is material in nature. So especially when we are talking about physical material things, then we want to believe that things are made up of some material substance, and those material substance has a particular set of qualities. And though at the same time, let's remember that when we talk about substance, that is more of a metaphysical notion, and as we have already talked about it, Locke would rather be inclined to say that there are qualities in an object, some of them primary, some of them secondary. Primary qualities exist within the object. Secondary qualities also exist within the object, but their presentation is subject to our view of them. So this is the one fundamental way in which they are different from primary qualities. So this distinction is not based on on the notion that primary qualities exist in the object and secondary qualities don't. That's not the idea, because this is how it's generally sort of confused many a times by us. So, but at the same time, Locke also says that we also want to believe that these qualities reside somewhere. They always require a location. It will be very absurd for us to believe that qualities could exist without any location. That would be sort of tantamount to some kind of idealism. And Locke is, not idealist, in the same sense as Berkeley is. He's an empiricist, but his empiricism does not, is not reductive in nature. He doesn't let it lapse into some kind of idealism. So Locke believes that there has to be some location where these primary and secondary qualities exist, and this is what we generally mean by the substance. But he says that since this substance is not available to us, is not available to us through our senses, so therefore there has to be a substance, but I don't know what. There has to be something to which these qualities are attached, are located in, but I don't know what this substance is. I don't know what it has to be there, but I don't know what it is. So this was generally speaking the view that Locke expressed. The basic idea that the point that we are trying to sort of drive home here is that the problem of identity is sort of tied up with the problem of essence, which is more metaphysical in nature, and since the idea of numerical identity completely does away with the content, the whatness of the thing, the identity of which is in question. So therefore, we'll have to have some kind of more robust a notion which is more robust than merely numerical identity of things. And the next good candidate probably would be the material basis of things, the substantial basis of things. But if we examine even that alternative, we'll find that also seems to fall short of the kind of metaphysical requirement that we generally have of a robust notion of identity. So, for example, I mean, even when we talk about some kind of material notion, I mean, what we mean by sort of materialist basis of identity is that something in the substance of things, something in the material basis of things, seems to persist over time, because of which an identity, some kind of continuity, sameness could be ascribed to that particular object. So, friends, we'll continue our discussion on personal identity. We'll talk more about the second alternative that's available to us, that's material notion of identity. We'll return after a short break. Thank you.
With this, thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. And friends, yes, of course, we will be back after a short break. You are requested to be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session where we are discussing on problem of personal identity, and we believe that you might have gathered lots of information through our previous session too, and through this session also we are going to give you the maximum knowledge. Friends, if you wish to ask a question on today's topic from Dr. Ajay Verma, who is our expert today, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1800-110-430. Now I would like to request Dr. Ajay Verma to continue the lecture further.
Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So we were talking about what could be the what could be the different bases along which we could have some kind of a philosophical formulation of the idea of identity. And along that line, we saw that if we talk about strictly numerical identity, that's a very thin notion and does not provide us a properly good, robust foundation to develop any good any robust notion of identity as such. And next in line, we want to discuss if some kind of material basis or some kind of substantial sort of notion we could develop about identity as such. But there, as we have discussed earlier in some detail, we come across a different hurdle altogether, because as we are aware, through the passage of time, things change. Now, the problem with the notion of identity or the notion of essence could also be actually becomes more clear to us vis-a-vis the problem of change. If if there's a particular essential basis, on the way, along which we could define the being of things as such, if there is if things are what they are in virtue of certain essences that that are there within the object, then the problem is that we cannot have a good, robust notion of change. Things, as a matter of fact, should always stay, as a matter of fact, because if there are certain essential qualities to objects, because of which they are what they are, then those qualities should exist with the object, being being intimately associated with it, and those should persist. And if those should persist, the object shouldn't change, and those minimal set of necessary and sufficient qualities that make things what it is should never go. But as we are all aware, and it doesn't require a big proof. It stands to observation. We all know that things change, and eventually things are also no more. So that being the case, that means change is perpetual. Change is something that that's undeniable. As a matter of fact, Buddhist philosophy, Indian school of Buddhist philosophy, comes very close to to several thinkers, at least to Hume, when it comes to the question of identity and personal identity. So the entire Buddhist philosophy, probably one of the starting points, of Buddhist philosophy is the observation that things change. Things are under perpetual change. So things are changing, as a matter of fact, according to them, every moment, because if changes are not happening every moment, then changes are not happening at all. So as also is evident from that story associated with the journey that the ordinary person, ordinary prince Gautama makes towards Buddhahood. So as we are already aware, the journey towards Buddhahood starts with with Buddha's viewing a certain set of events that people change, our bodies change, we become old, and eventually we are no more. So there's a fundamental aspect of anything in the universe, from the smallest to the biggest. Things change and things also cease to exist. Now, if we have any strict notion about identity of a thing with a proper metaphysical basis, then it would become very difficult for us to explain change in that case. So, but we'll come to that later. At the moment, we just want to examine the second alternative to numerical identity, which is some kind of notion of identity along the material makeup of a certain thing. But as we have discussed earlier about this, the problem there is that things seem to have some kind of a functional unity, some kind of a structural unity, and parts could keep on getting replaced. To understand what we are talking about here, we have earlier tried to understand it with the example of ship of Theseus, which is the classical example that's been offered to explain the idea of identity. So there we know that the problem is that if there is a ship made of different wooden blocks, then as certain wooden blocks, planks in the ship become old, then they need to be replaced with new ones, and eventually the ship is going to have all the new wooden blocks. And then the question would be, even though as a functional as an object which is functioning in a particular way, it is still the same object. It still has the same numerical identity. But if we have a strict sort of if we conflate the notion of identity with its material makeup, then after a particular point of time, the object would have nothing in material terms that it had at the point of its origin, at which it had at the point of its coming into being. So that way, if we look at identity of something in terms of its functional unity, then we can very confidently say, well, it's the same ship because it's still performing the same function, and in terms of that functional unity, it's still the same thing. But most of the time, we consider it to be some kind of requirement that thing, in order to continue in time and thing, when we talk about its persistence in time, at the back of our mind, somehow we also want to believe that that object is also materially the same, because material sameness seems to be some kind of a fundamental requirement of for the sameness of that object. It seems to be some kind of a fundamental requirement for believing that this object is the same object through the passage of time. It has remained as this. It has remained as the same object through a passage of time. So, through this example, we see that if we take into account the second alternative, which is some kind of material basis to ascribe identity to something, then that also falls short somewhere, because all material is undergoing perpetual change. where different and we know where parts are replaced by new parts, and that's true of our body also, as we have discussed it earlier. Our body is nothing but conglomeration of different kind of cells and tissues. Cells go on to make up tissues go on to make up organs, and organs together form systems, and this kind of a systematic unity of different systems forms the kind of individual being that we are, the person that we are. So there is some sense in talking about how we could have some notion of identity in terms of the substance out of which we are composed, out of which goes into the making of us, some kind of material unity that we all have. But as pointed out by Locke also, it's more of a functional unity than anything else. Because even if we talk about our own bodies, we know that different cells die out, and they're replaced by new cells, and this process of rejuvenation is extremely important. If the old cells are not replaced, then we would fall sick. So therefore, our body also undergoes a perpetual change, which results in aging and so on and so forth. So we still want to believe that it's the same me. It's the same me which has persisted through the passage of time, from the point of my birth up to the point where the person is no more. It's the same individual which has lived out a particular span of life. We want to believe that there was some kind of individuation principle, some kind of a unity within that individuation, on the basis of which we form this kind of individuation. So the point here is that even this material unity seems to be insufficient to provide us some robust notion of personal identity for ourselves. And Locke, sort of comes with yet another alternative to rescue the notion of personal identity. Because if nothing is there, then we'll have to give up the notion of personal identity altogether. But the problem that that in that case that would crop up, and something that we have already discussed, is that without the notion of personal identity, there is there is a lot else in philosophy, the discussion on which would completely collapse. Say, for example, when we talk about at epistemological level, all judgments that we form need to belong somewhere. This is some kind of transcendental requirement. Kant sort of tries to restore some kind of a notion of the self after Hume challenges it in a big way, in a very fundamental way, and destroys the very foundation on the basis of which we form some kind of notion of personal identity. It leads us into huge problems, epistemological problems, as pointed out by Kant. And so, therefore, in his discussion on unity of perception, Kant points out that there is some kind of transcendental requirement. So, on the basis of some kind of transcendental reduction, we'll have to come up with some kind of a notion of I, which would own up any judgment that that I form. So at epistemological level, without a robust notion of self, without a robust notion of personal identity, there will be a huge problem in terms of who owns the judgment that are formed, who is it that are formulating the judgment. At the level of ethics, there will be a huge problem regarding agency. if there is no person, if people don't have any identity, if there is nothing that persists along with an individual, then how do we decide about rightness or wrongness of action? How do we decide about who committed that action? So at times, if some wrong if some wrong action is committed, then then the responsibility needs to be fixed for that. And when we talk about responsibility, the question of responsibility brings up the question of who owns the responsibility, and the question of who makes its appearance before us. And when the question of who makes its appearance before us, basically the question that we are asking is that of personal identity. There has to be some who has to own up the responsibility for an action, and on the basis of that personhood of that an object of that particular person, some kind of responsibility could be fixed, and so on and so forth. So we cannot completely give up, we cannot completely do away with the idea of personal identity, and Locke tries to rescue it by saying that so far as we remember, so far as we have a consciousness, so far as we have an awareness of some of the previous events that have taken place in us, that so far as we remember our being there in the past, so far as we remember certain deeds that we committed in the past, so far as we have the consciousness of those events, so far as that memory is there, there is something that continues to exist within us. So consciousness, a species of which is memory. Memory allows us to move back and forth in time without losing our anchor in the present, without losing our anchorage, so to speak, some point of anchoring ourselves in the present. Without losing out on that, memory allows us to move back in time, at least, if not forth in time. But if we have, on the basis of memory of past events, we form a certain trajectory of events, and on the basis of that trajectory of events, and having known certain regularities, being observed, which have been observed in the past by us, we can project, that trajectory into the future as well. So, memory provides us a fundamental, point of fulcrum, where we could sort of have a firm foundation for some kind of notion of personal identity to emerge. And this is what Locke seems to do for us. So he says that that memory, is that substance which cements up, so to speak, which glues up together, different moments in time, and tries to sort of present before us not discrete moments as such, but rather chain of events with certain kind of historicality to them. So things appear before us in a particular chain of events. And to understand it more fully, we can contrast it, say, for example, with the idea, that Buddhist philosophers try to put forth before us. So there, the idea is that only parts are real. So in their notion of what they call Kshanikvad, or the notion of momentariness, Buddhists point out that only the moments are real. and the connections between those movements are constructed, are mere constructions of mind, and therefore are unreal. So for them, only individual atoms of time, called kshana, discrete movements, also known as swalakshanas, unique particular movements, are real. But if that is the case, then any conglomeration, the moment we form a kind of a chain of events, as if there is some kind of persistence through movements, as if one movement gives way to the other, in such a way that there is a continuity between the movements, then we could have some way of coming up with some robust notion of personal identity. But since for Buddhists these movements are unconnected, therefore there is no space at all for any robust notion of identity or personal identity to emerge within the Buddhist worldview. So Locke tries to rescue the notion of personal identity from falling into that kind of situation. So Locke points out that so far as we are people, we are persons with memory, and so far as we remember that in past certain events have taken place with us, and so far as we remember them, and so far as we remember that we are the same person who slept last night and who had breakfast at morning prior to that, who had lunch and performed particular tasks from day to night. So far as we have a memory of having done all those things, there is something that's persisting in us. But the problem that arises here is that if that is the case, then memory, becomes feeble. As we age, we may not remember so very well certain events that, that might have taken place with us during childhood. Not far away, during our teenage, we would have better memories of those events. And since eventually, we start losing, like the same intensity of impressions in those memories is lost. So we could say that, in that sense, this problem, that this notion of personal identity formed on the basis of memory, is challenged in a certain way. But Hume, actually going further than that, tries to point out that memory is only a tool. Memory is only a tool which is confused for substance as such, which persists in time. So having known the problem that lies in Locke's presentation of the notion of personal identity, and the way he tries to resolve this issue of personal identity, and the way he tries to rescue it, he tries to not to let it fall into lapse into some kind of metaphysical vacuum, the kind that we see in Buddhist philosophy. But actually Hume tries to push Locke further and points out that the kind of a situation of lapse that Buddhist philosophy is representative of is something that seems to be inevitable to us. If we take into consideration some of the questions that Locke himself brings up and brings up for discussion, then we'll find that Locke does not does not take some of the philosophical ruminations that he engages with to their logical conclusions, and his attempt is more to save the notion of personal identity in some way or the other. Hume, on the other hand, sort of is more open to the challenge, and tries to take some of the fundamental suppositions of Locke to their logical conclusion. So let's begin with one of the most basic passages that we find in Hume text. That is his treatise on human nature. Let's read out a passage from him, and we will become more clear about what is his formulation of the problem of personal identity. So let's read a passage from his text. Hume points out, and I quote, there are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment conscious of what we call ourself. Probably he may be referring here to Locke also, we are not sure though. That we feel its existence and continuance in existence, at least according to Locke, on the basis of memory we could say that we are conscious of what we call ourselves, and that we feel its existence and continuance in existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of a demonstration both of its perfect identity and simplicity. But from what impression could this idea be derived? This question is in a way, in a very different way formulated by Locke also. And this is a fundamental presupposition for Hume, that whatever idea that we may have has to be, at the back of it can be traced back to some impression. Which is nothing but the qualitative impact of an object upon us. But from what impression could this idea be derived from? Impression of personal identity. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, and this is the most celebrated phrase from this text on personal identity. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception. I may venture to affirm that persons are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. So this bundle theory, which has actually, its foundations basically in Locke. So as we were trying to sort of point out earlier, Hume does nothing but tries to take Locke to some kind of a logical conclusion, which Locke himself seems to be refraining from, because it seems to be leading towards certain kind of skepticism, and Locke seems to be a little unprepared for that. So as we saw earlier, Locke himself had pointed out this idea that what we call an object is nothing but a bundle of primary and secondary qualities. Though at the same time we know that since these qualities have to exist somewhere, have to have a location, therefore some kind of a notion of substance is some kind of a metaphysical requirement for something to exist at all. Otherwise, it would lapse into some kind of pure idea without any basis as such, and we wouldn't feel very happy with this kind of formulation. So, but if we talk about personal identity on the same basis, what logically has to follow from there is that just in the same fashion, since when we also look into ourselves, we just find certain feelings, perceptions, it could be logically concluded from there that in a similar fashion we are also simply a bundle of those perceptions, and nothing more than that, and there seems to be no substantial basis underlying it where all these perceptions seem to reside. So friends, we will elaborate more upon the Hume's idea of personal identity in our next lecture. That is it for today. Thank you.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And friends, your feedbacks are important for us, so do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We would meet you again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye.